At the fence line, Elise pressed tiny roots into cold soil while four men watched and laughed. To them, she was wasting good land. But what if the quietest work in an orchard is the one that finally answers every insult? Fong Rao Song Som. The first laugh came before Elise had even pressed the shovel into the ground. She stood at the old fence line with a bundle of bare roots tucked under one arm. The toes of her boots sunk into the cold spring mud. On the other side of the wire, four orchard men had stopped where the pasture dipped toward the marlow trees. They were not shouting. That might have been easier. They were smiling the way men smiled when they thought a mistake was too obvious to be argued with. One of them lifted his coffee cup toward the little bundle in her arms. "You planting an orchard or a flower bed, Elise?" The others chuckled. Elise looked down the fence line instead of at them. The old posts leaned in places. Beyond them, the apple trees stood in uneven rows, their branches still thin from winter, their buds not yet brave enough to open. The ground near the fence had always been hard to work. Her mother used to call it stubborn soil. Her husband had called it a waste of diesel. Elise set the roots down, drove the shovel into the earth, and pushed with her foot until the blade disappeared. "Good apple ground," another man said. "And she's giving it to weeds." She did not answer. That was one thing people in the valley still had not grown used to about Elise Marlowe. She was not rude, she was not timid, she simply did not spend many words where they would not change the weather. At 46, she had already learned that some people mistook silence for surrender. She let them. The hole opened slowly. The soil came up in heavy clumps, dark on the top and tired underneath. Elise bent, placed the first small plant in the ground and packed the earth around it with both hands. A native shrub, nothing impressive to look at. Bare stem, thin roots, no promise visible to anyone passing by. The men watched as if she were burying money. "You know Gordon's going to love this," one of them said. "First season and she's already taking land out of production." A softer laugh moved along the fence. Not cruel enough to accuse, not kind enough to forget. Elise reached for another bundle. The sun climbed and the men eventually drifted away, still talking among themselves. Their laughter stayed longer than they did. It clung to the wire, to the damp cuff of her jeans, to the back of her neck each time she bent down. By mid-morning, she had planted only a short stretch, and her palms had started to burn. She leaned on the shovel once, just long enough to look toward the house. The Marlowe farmhouse sat beyond the first block of trees, its paint weathered, its porch steps sagging a little on one side. The place looked smaller after a funeral. Rooms that had once held noise now seemed to listen back. A pair of work gloves still hung near the shed door where her husband had left them, and every time Elise passed them she felt the small, sharp pull of a life that had ended before its chores were done. Mason was by the shed when she came in for water. He had a stack of empty apple crates beside him and a look on his face he had been trying to hide since he arrived 2 days earlier. "You started already," he said. Elise rinsed mud from her hands under the spigot. "Ground soft enough." He looked past her toward the fence line. "Mom, I thought you were going to think about it first." "I did. For one night, for longer than that." Mason pressed his lips together. He was old enough to know better than to sound like a child, but worry made him young again. "You're taking out usable ground. I'm using it. Not for apples." Elise turned off the water and shook her hands once before reaching for the towel on the nail. She could hear what he was not saying. She could hear the bills in his voice, the harvest numbers, the equipment repairs they had postponed, the way he had looked around the kitchen that morning, as if the house itself might ask him for money. He loved her. That was the trouble. Fear had roots too. Gordon called. Elise folded the towel slowly. "About what?" "He said he'd be at the co-op this afternoon. He wants you to come in. Says there's an offer you should see before you put more money into this place." She looked toward the shed door. For a moment her eyes landed on the old hinges, the cracked boards, the dark seam where the door never closed right. Inside were tools, broken ladders, old labels from apple crates, and the kind of dust that belonged to families, not neglect. "What kind of offer?" Mason lowered his voice, though no one was near enough to hear. "The road frontage." Elise said nothing. "It wouldn't be the whole orchard," he added quickly. "Just that piece by the road. Gordon said a cider company wants access. It could help you breathe a little. Help you breathe." That was the phrase people used when they wanted a person to loosen their grip. That afternoon the co-op office faintly of paper, coffee, and stored apples. Gordon Pike stood when Elise came in, all courtesy and clean sleeves. He had a way of making pressure feel like advice. Mason sat beside her, his knee bouncing once before he stilled it. Gordon slid a folder across the table. "No one's trying to push you, Elise," he said. "But the numbers are the numbers. Your mother held on longer than most could have. Your husband did what he could." Now, you've got to decide what's practical. Elise opened the folder. The offer was printed neatly, clipped to a simple map of the property. The strip along the road was marked in pale gray. It looked small on paper, almost harmless. That ground gives the orchard its face, she said. Gordon smiled gently, as if he had expected sentiment and had come prepared to be patient with it. A face doesn't pay pruning crews. Mason shifted beside her. He did not agree out loud. He did not need to. His silence had weight. Gordon tapped the map once. You sell this piece, you keep the rest. You refuse, and you're betting everything on trees that are already underperforming and a fence line full of plants nobody asked for. Elise closed the folder but did not push it back. Through the office window she could see a sliver of the parking lot and, beyond it, the pale rise of orchards running toward the lake. Generations of families had stood in rooms like this and called their fear by respectable names: efficiency, expansion, timing, common sense. Mason finally spoke. "Mom, I just don't want you trapped." She looked at him then. His face was tired, older than it should have been, and full of the kind of love that could still wound. "I know," she said. Gordon leaned back slightly, sensing the ground soften. "Take the evening, but don't wait too long. Good offers don't sit forever." Elise picked up the folder and held it against her chest as she stood. The paper felt thin, but it carried the weight of the whole farm. Outside, the afternoon had turned warmer, and mud from the morning still clung to the edges of her boots. When she reached the truck, Mason opened the passenger door for her and looked back toward the co-op office. "What if keeping it isn't saving it?" he asked quietly. "What if keeping it is what ruins you?" Elise did not answer right away. She looked past him toward the direction of the orchard, where the first small roots were already hidden under the soil, invisible to everyone but her. Then she climbed into the truck with the offer still in her hands. By the time Elise got home from the co-op, the folder had warmed against her lap, but the offer inside it felt colder than when Gordon had first slid it across the table. Mason carried the empty apple crates back into the shed without being asked. He did it carefully, almost too carefully, the way people moved around grief when they did not know what else to do with their hands. Elise stood in the yard a moment longer with the folder under her arm, looking toward the fence line where the first small plants sat in the mud like mistakes everyone could see. She should have gone inside. She should have put the folder on the kitchen table, made coffee, and talked numbers with her son like a practical woman. Instead, she walked to the shed, the door stuck halfway, as it always did. Elise pulled harder and the old wood gave with a tired groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust, burlap, dry leaves, and a little of the oil her husband used to keep on the workbench. Shafts of afternoon light fell over stacks of apple crates and bundles of faded labels. For a while she did not move. The shed held too many hands at once, her mother's, her husband's, her own when she was a girl. She set Gordon's folder on a crate and reached for a box of old labels. Most were printed with the Marlowe name in a red that had almost turned brown. On the back of one, in her mother's small pencil writing, were 3 words: "North Bloom Late." Elise turned it over, then reached for another: "Wild Asters by Fence." Another: "Bees Stayed Longer." Her throat tightened before she understood why. Behind a stack of broken picking baskets half covered by a canvas tarp, the first bee box, then another, then 3 more, their paint worn thin, their corners rough, their lids warped from years of damp air. They were not pretty, they did not look useful, but Elise stood in front of them as if someone had spoken her name from another room. Mason came to the shed door. "Mom?" She did not answer right away. She lifted one lid and found old comb, dry and dark, tucked inside like a memory that had never been thrown away. "Your grandmother kept these," she said. Mason stepped in, but not far. "I didn't know we had any." "Neither did I." He looked at the boxes, then at the folder on the crate. "What are you thinking?" Elise ran her thumb over the edge of the wood. "I'm thinking I need to call Walter Keene." Mason's face changed. Not anger. Not yet. More like disappointment arriving early. "The beekeeper? He knew my mother. He's old, Mom." "So are good things," and looked away. Walter came the next morning in a faded cap and a jacket that had seen more springs than most men admitted to. He did not greet the boxes like junk. He took his time with each one, lifting, tapping, smelling the wood, scraping gently at an old seam with his pocket knife. Elise watched his hands. They moved slowly, but nothing in them trembled. After several quiet minutes, he said, "She tried." Elise looked up. "My mother?" Walter nodded. "Your mother wanted local bees in this orchard. Said rented hives came and went like salesmen. Said the orchard needed something that lived here." Elise held the nearest box by both sides. "Why didn't she keep going?" Walter glanced toward the house, then toward the rows of apple trees. "Too much work." "Too little help? Your father didn't think much of it." Later, her knees got bad, and the some don't die because they're wrong, Elise. Some just outweight the person who started them. The words settled harder than advice. Walter warned her before he agreed to help. The boxes would need repair. The fence-line plants would need time. Native flowers would not bring a full answer in a week, or even one clean season. If she wanted something to show Gordon by harvest, this was not it. Elise listened without interrupting. When he was done, she picked up one of the old crate labels and turned it so he could see her mother's pencil notes. "I don't need it fast," she said. "I need it real." Walter studied her then, not the boxes. By the end of that morning, he had set 2 of the better hives aside and given her a list short enough to fit in her coat pocket. What to clean, what to mend, what to plant near the fence, and what to leave alone. Elise wrote his words on the backs of old labels because that was what she had and because her mother had done the same. The first season did not reward her. The strip along the fence grew unevenly. Some plants, some dried out, some looked like nothing more than weeds to anyone driving past. The space they occupied had once held a few extra rows of apples, and by late summer the loss could be measured. Not ruin, not yet, but enough for men at the co-op to lower their voices when Elise came in. Enough for Gordon to ask kindly whether she still had the folder. Mason stopped walking the fence line with her. He still came by. He fixed a loose hinge on the porch. He hauled a crate when she needed him. He left groceries on the counter and pretended he had bought too much for himself. But when Elise talked about the flowers, or the hives, or Walter's notes, his eyes moved to the sink, the window, the floor, anywhere but her face. One evening she found him at the kitchen table with the season's numbers spread out in front of him. The room was warm, but the silence between them not. "You wrote down every row," he said. "I need to know what changes." He touched one page with his finger. This changed. Elise knew what he meant. The yield was down along the edge where the new planting had taken space and given back nothing visible. "It's the first season," she said, "and if the second one looks like this—" She did not answer quickly enough. Mason leaned back, tired of trying to sound gentle. "I'm not against you. I just don't know how to watch you lose this place one careful decision at a time." Elise folded one of the old labels in half, then smoothed it flat again. Her mother's pencil marks had faded, but they were still there. The next week, Gordon called. He did not mention the offer first. He asked about harvest. He asked whether she needed help moving product through the co-op. He sounded concerned in the smooth way that made concern feel like a door closing. "Some buyers get nervous when numbers dip," he said. "They like consistency. I know what buyers like, I'm sure you do. But I'd hate to see your mother's place lose, standing over an experiment." Elise looked out the window toward the fence line. A few late flowers held on in the wind, small and stubborn. Near one of the repaired boxes, a single bee moved slowly over a bloom as a whole orchard arrowed to that one bit of work. "I'll bring in what I have," she said. Gordon paused. "Of course." The call, she wrote 3 figures on the back of a crate label. "Yield down, hive active." Mason worried. Then she set the pencil beside the paper and pressed both hands flat on the table. The season had given Gordon exactly what he needed. It had given Mason every reason to doubt her, and it had given Elise nothing she could point to except a few repaired boxes, a thin line of flowers, and the feeling that her mother had once stood in the same uncertainty and stopped too soon. Outside, the fence line disappeared into the evening. Elise looked at it until the kitchen glass reflected her own face back at her, and for the first time since she had planted the first root, she understood that believing in something was easier before it cost you proof. En Comdain by the next spring, Elise had stopped looking at the fence line as if it owed her an apology. The flowers had come back unevenly, but they had come back. Small clusters first, then low waves of color along the wire where the ground had looked bare and foolish the season before. The repaired hive boxes sat beyond the first row of apple trees, plain and weathered, with Walter's careful marks still penciled on the lids. Elise checked them in the mornings before she checked the mailbox. There was still no triumph in it. No one had walked over from the neighboring orchards to admit they had been wrong. Mason still watched the place with the guarded face of a son trying not to hope too soon. Gordon still smiled at her in town, as if patience were something he had granted her. But the fence line was no longer silent. On a cool morning during bloom, Elise stood near the first row with a crate label in one and the other. She had learned to write small because the labels did not give her much room. Bloom full, bees active near south hive, wind light. She paused before adding the last note, fruit set looks even. She did not let herself smile, not yet. Across the road, one of the larger orchards sat strangely still. Trees were in flower, but men moved through the rows with the hard, fast steps of people searching for something missing. A truck that should have carried hive boxes sat near the barn with its tailgate down. Two growers stood beside it, arms folded, looking toward the trees as though the branches had betrayed them. By noon, word had moved faster than weather. The rented bees had not come in right. Some hives were weak, some were late. Some had been redirected before they reached the smaller growers. No one called it a disaster, not out loud. But in orchard country, timing was not a small thing. Apple blossoms did not wait politely for business problems to settle. Elise heard it first at the co-op counter, where two men stopped talking when she came in with her invoices. One of them glanced at her boots, then at the paper in her hand. "Your bloom holding?" he asked. She looked at him for a second longer than he expected. "So far," he nodded, but not like a man making conversation. He nodded like a man something had meant measure. That afternoon, Mason came by without calling first. He found her near the fence line, crouched beside one of the low shrubs, watching bees move from the flowers toward the apple rows. "I heard about the hives," he said. Elise kept her eyes on the branches. "I heard too. Is that why yours look different?" She stood slowly. "Different how?" Mason looked down the row. The trees were not heavy with fruit yet. It was too early for that. But the small beginnings were there, tucked behind petals more even than he had expected. He stepped closer to the hive box, then stopped as if afraid to disturb what he did not understand. "I don't know," he said. "Just not empty." Elise folded the crate label and slipped it into her shirt pocket. She wanted to say something steady, something that would make him understand. Instead, she remembered the way he had sat at the kitchen table with the season's numbers, trying to accuse her of ruining herself. So she said only, "We'll see what holds." Mason looked at her then. His face had not softened completely, but it had changed. Doubt was still there, only now it had company. By the end of the week, Gordon had changed too, not in public. In public, he was the same careful man with clean sleeves and a voice made from her calming rooms. But he called Elise into the co-op office before finished unloading her sample crates. The delivery list lay open on his desk, several names marked in pencil. "Nothing final," he said before she sat down. "Planning." Elise remained standing. Planning what? Buyer commitments, volume expectations, reliability. There it was. Reliability. A word polished smooth enough to hide a blade. Gordon tapped the list with his pencil. "Some buyers may prefer growers with a stronger history of consistency. Last season was difficult for you. I'm trying to make sure nobody is overpromised." Elise looked at the list. Her orchard name sat near the bottom, not crossed out but close enough to the edge of the page to make the message clear. "My bloom is holding," she said. "I'm glad to hear that. You don't sound glad." Gordon's expression did not move much. "Elise, one decent bloom doesn't erase a weak year," she could have argued. She could have told him about the hive boxes, the flowers, the notes on the labels, the way the bees had worked the fence line while other orchards waited on trucks that came late. But standing in that office, she understood that Gordon did not want evidence yet. Evidence would only become real to him when someone with more power repeated it. So she said nothing. That silence bothered him more than protest would have. He closed the folder halfway, then opened it again. "I'm only saying," he added, "don't count on every channel being available." Elise nodded once. She left with her papers in the same order she had brought them, but the ground under her feet felt less certain than it had that morning. A good bloom did not matter if the fruit had nowhere to go. When she returned to the orchard, a woman was standing near the first block of trees with a notebook in her hand. Elise slowed the truck before she reached the barn. Mason was already there, leaning against a post, watching the stranger with the same guarded look he had once given the fence line. The woman was not dressed like a grower and not dressed like someone taking a Sunday drive. She wore practical shoes and moved down the row without touching anything, stopping every few trees to look from the blossoms to the fence, then to the hive boxes. Mason came to Elise's window. "She says her name is Tessa Mayfield." Elise turned off the engine. She asked if she could walk the rows, Mason said. "I told her it was your call." Elise looked toward the woman. Tessa did not wave. She did not hurry over with a bright smile or a promise. She simply stood between two trees, studying the small green beginnings behind the petals as if the answer might be there if she took enough time to see it. Elise stepped out of the truck. Tessa met her halfway, calm and direct. "I've heard two versions of your orchard," she said. "One says you're taking risks you can't afford. The other says your trees are setting better than they should this year." Elise felt Mason watching her. Beyond the barn, the repaired hives sat in the mild afternoon, bees crossing the air in quiet lines. "And which one did you come to believe?" Elise asked. Tessa glanced toward the fence line before answering. "Neither." She opened her notebook. "I came to walk it myself." Muatauta Chontessa did not ask for a chair, a sales sheet, or a promise. She walked the orchard slowly, the way Walter had once walked the shed, taking her time with what other people had already judged. Elise kept a few steps behind her, hands tucked into the pockets of her work jacket, saying only what was asked. Mason followed farther back, quiet enough that his boots in the grass sounded louder than his breathing. At the end of the third row, Tessa stopped and looked to the fence line. Bees moved in and out of the flowers in thin, steady paths. The hive boxes sat plain and weathered near the edge. Not pretty enough for a brochure, not new enough to impress anyone who liked shiny answers. Tessa wrote something in her notebook. Gordon called before supper. His voice had the same careful warmth it always carried, but the edges had hardened. Elise, I need you at the co-op in the morning. We're finalizing the delivery list. The list isn't final. It has to reflect buyer confidence. She looked across the kitchen at Mason, who had heard enough to lower his eyes. The season's old numbers still lived in that room, even when the papers were put away. I'll be there, Elise said. The next morning, the co-op office felt smaller than it ever had. Gordon sat at the head of the table with the delivery list in front of him. Mason stood near the wall, not quite beside his mother and not quite away from her. Walter had come too, though he took the last chair and said nothing. He rested both hands on his cane, his old cap folded on his knee. Gordon did not waste time. Elise, he said, no one is questioning your effort, but this co-op has commitment. Last season's numbers were weak and buyers noticed that. We can't ask them to take risks because one orchard may be turning around. Maybe. The phrase hung in the room as if the work of 2 seasons could be reduced to a maybe. Elise kept her hands folded. She could see the list from where she sat. Her orchard was marked in pencil again, close to being moved out of the main route. The old anger rose in her, but it came quietly. It had no interest in shouting. Before she answered, the office door opened. Tessa stepped in, her notebook under one arm and a slim folder in the other. She did not look rushed. She looked like a woman who had already made up her mind and was only choosing the cleanest way to say it. Am I late? She asked. Gordon stood halfway. We were discussing grower reliability. I know. Tessa set the folder on the table. That is why I'm here. The room went still. Tessa turned to Elise first. I walked your rows yesterday twice. I checked your early set, your edge rows, your interior rows, and your hive line. I also tasted from last season's remaining storage batch. Gordon's smile thinned. Last season was the concern. It was, Tessa said. But last season also explains this season. No one spoke. She opened the folder and slid a short contract across the table toward Elise. My company wants your apples for our small batch cider line this harvest. Premium rate, limited volume to start, with an option to renew if the quality holds. The condition is simple. The pollinator strip and the local hive system stay in place. Mason looked at the paper before Elise did. Gordon sat back slowly. You're basing a purchase decision on a fence line. I'm basing it on fruit set, flavor consistency, and risk management, Tess said. The fence is part of why those things are there. Walter's eyes lowered, but the corner of his mouth moved just enough for Elise to notice. Gordon tapped the delivery list with one finger. The co-op controls routing, and I'm requesting her lot directly, Tessa replied. If routing is an issue, we can arrange pickup. That was the moment Gordon understood, not all at once perhaps, but enough. The list in front of him, the one he had used like a gate, no longer held the only road out of Elise's orchard. Elise looked down at the contract. It was not a fortune. It would not repair every machine, pay every bill, or erase the long months when her son had looked at her with fear. But it was real. It had numbers. It had conditions. It had her orchard's name. Wordful heights and not move it. Mason stepped closer to the table. Mom, he said softly. Elise did not pick up the pen right away. She looked at Gordon, then at Tessa, then at Walter. At last she said, if this goes through, I want one more thing discussed here. Gordon's face tightened. This isn't the time to add terms. It isn't a term for her, Elise said, nodding toward Tessa. Fair us. She touched the edge of the delivery list. There are growers smaller than me who can't afford rented hives every season. If the co-op wants consistency, then help them build it. Set aside a fund, small grants, shared equipment, help with native planting. Not someday this season. A few people outside the office had gathered near the door, drawn by the quiet. Among them were 2 of the men who had laughed at her at the fence. Neither one met her eyes. Gordon opened his mouth, then closed it. He had lost too much ground to sound generous and too much audience to refuse easily. Tessa capped her pen. That would make your co-op more attractive to buyers like me. That settled it. The vote did not happen that minute, but the decision had already turned. By the time harvest began, Gordon was no longer the only voice setting terms for small growers. He remained at the table, but he no longer owned the room. The fun started modestly with rules, limits, and more paperwork than anyone liked. Still it started. A week into picking, Mason came back with lumber in the bed of his truck. Elise found him near the fence line, kneeling in the grass with a small painted sign beside him. He had sanded the edges smooth. The letters were simple and careful. Pollinator Row. He did not look up at first. I should trusted you sooner. Elise stood with a half-filled picking bag against her hip. You were scared, so you're you. Yes, she said. But I had something to do with mine. Mason nodded once, then drove the signpost into the soil. Walter watched from beneath an apple tree, his cap low against the sun. When Elise handed him one of the first picked apples, he turned it in his palm like it was more than fruit. Maybe to him it was. Later that fall, children from neighboring farms walked the row with their parents, stopping at the flowers, the hive boxes, and the new sign Mason had made. Elise did not give speeches. She showed them the bees moving quietly from bloom to bloom and let the orchard speak in its own slow way. At the end of the fence, she tucked one old crate label behind the signpost, the pencil writing faded but still legible. Then she rested her hand on the warm wood Mason had set into the ground, while the apple trees behind her held their fruit in the light.